3 figures, phallic necks. There's one with a sort of paw on what looks like a huge scrubbing brush, which is snarling, and they're baying their anger, their pain, their distrust of life.
To the people who walked into the Lefebvre Gallery that day, that was a shock. I mean, they had never really seen anything like it.
It was just after the war when people didn't want to be disturbed. They'd been deeply disturbed already.
Something breaks in that painting in English culture. It was as if art had become feral. Those things are all in the background. They all inform the work. But you make a mistake if you explain the paintings through the war. What Bacon did was something different.
At that first exhibition, one of the usual bitchy critics to me said, why bother to do things like that when it's already been done by Picasso?
So many people of my generation, that's where they first saw an image by Francis Bacon, but nobody knew who Francis Bacon was.
After the war, the entire sort of bohemian London began to coalesce around the gargoyle. And then, of course, with the opening of the Colony Room by Muriel Belter, that became sort of the epicenter of the lives of most of the painters. And, of course, Francis Bacon was part of that.
Francis had an extraordinary capacity to take advantage of any situation in which he found himself and to turn it into something wonderful and magical, and so you were immediately enchanted by his presence.
It was like a piece of electricity coming into the room. I mean, charisma poured out of him. You couldn't take your eyes off him, you know. He darted around like a bird, and these extraordinary eyes.
Début venu à Londres, il adorait aller avec moi boire. Il n'est jamais arrivé à me faire tomber par terre par l'alcool.
When I met him, I could not equate just the general sort of drunken foolery that went on, which I found hugely entertaining, with these twisted horrors. This is the great central enigma about Bacon. Where did the darkness come from? It was Graham Sutherland, I think, who recommended him to Erica Browson, who was one of the brightest contemporary art dealers of the time. And when she saw his work, she saw the point of it right away.
He was always needing money to waste, you know, to gamble away. He was nothing but trouble to her. And she just tolerated it and helped him as best she could.
He could gamble in London, for goodness sake, to some extent. And he went to Monaco, and it was the place where English people of his kind went, and if he wanted to gamble, it's the most glamorous place to go still to gamble.
Ah oui, au casino et à Monte-Carlo. Il jouait à toutes les tables, brutalement, comme ça, des piles de pièces. C'était un besoin la chance. Il aimait les risques comme risquer de tomber.
He was there most of the time between 1946, 49, even into early 1950, and produced almost nothing.
He was terrible about getting paintings in on time. Browson is always writing Bacon and saying, you know, Francis, please, we have a show planned for next December, and you know, how's it going? 3 months later, nothing. And his typical pattern was that he would destroy all his work until pretty near to a show, when he would have to produce some paintings, finally.
He'd been rethinking what he must do in his art. He knew he must say something. It was no use being derivative of Picasso. And he knew, in fact, his subject must be the human body, and that it must come from his own life and his own experience. Part of what he had to express needed a new way of painting.
The heads are astonishing. They're so close to the animal. the animal and the man. In those images that Bacon did, it's as if you can feel the breath of the animal on your neck, or as if you're going into some dark cave and you smell the animal before you see it. I mean, it's so visceral. The animal is so close.
Dennis and Francis Bacon came from a similar background. Both were untrained as artists, so this was a link. That both self-taught. Francis Bacon was inevitably the main event in Dennis's life. Dickie and Dennis were the main event in each other's lives. Richard Chopping, known as Dickie, was his partner. Bacon could have actually been a hell of a lot of trouble to the relationship, but he wasn't. And Dennis would put up with anything, Francis would equally put up with anything that Dennis threw at him. And between them, this relationship went like that for many, many years. There were a lot of things that they were using as common subject matter. They both had boxing magazines, they had magazines of runners, they used Edward Mybridge's work.
Dennis did introduce Francis to Mybridge, arguably the most, with Picasso, the most important influence on his work.
It's a very interesting work, and the images were tremendously suggestive to me of ways I could use the human body.
Francis drew badly and was very conscious of it. And I think facing up to the fact that he had never been taught drawing, he used Mybridge's amazing photographs of athletes in weird positions again and again, because the limbs were dead accurate, and he could use them as it were as sketches for a whole series of paintings. Above all, the painting known as The Buggers.
I used to go and visit Lucian Freud and Caroline Blackwood. In their house, they had the painting, which they always called The Buggers, which is, I think, officially called The Wrestlers. I just simply thought it was a wonderful painting. I think that when you're very young, you don't have preconceived notions of what is shocking. You just look at things to see if they are beautiful.
There is no doubt that this is Bacon and the most important lover in his life. This is their coupling, this is their moment of greatest intensity, and this is the trigger, really, of Bacon's greatest images. It's where everything comes together.
Francis's first major lover was Peter Lacy. He had been a Spitfire pilot. Francis was wildly in love.
Bacon found him very charming. He said he was amusing, and he played the piano, he sang, and Bacon saw him as somebody quite extraordinary. Other people didn't have this very enamored view of Peter Lacy.
I remember going to a gay bar one evening, and Peter Lacy was there. He was very sort of soberly dressed, very straightforward, but he turned out to be, in fact, one of the most sadistic people I've ever come across.
During the war, his nervous system was basically shot, and he could become very violent.
Francis was landed with a sadist who was going to thrash him to bits.
À quel point le contrôle était important pour lui? Est-ce qu'il avait besoin de contrôler les choses?
Où il avait des instincts totalement naturels et brutals aussi. Mais pour ses sentiments, je crois qu'avec l'Archie, il n'avait pas de contrôle. C'est pour ça que je pense que c'était vraiment le grand amour.
They had a turbulent relationship. Lacy regularly beat Bacon up, and that was something that Bacon actively encouraged and enjoyed.
Peter had a house in the country, and Francis went there one weekend. God knows what he'd done to him already, but Peter Lacy simply threw him through a plate glass window on the second floor onto the garden and at the back of the house. And Francis had terrible damage to one eye and to his face and so on, but this made him love Peter Lacy more, I think. And he turned these horrible, terrible things into magic, into great paintings.
Peter himself was very often the subject of any male figure in the painting. He's always there, and I think he stirred the very depths of Bacon's being. He managed to create these very strange, eerie images against a dark blue background, very ghostly.
Peter Lacy's power over Francis, sadistic power over Francis, and I hope it won't shock people, was a very positive one.
It was regarded as a rather dirty habit to go and look at the paintings of Bacon, because the whole fashion was abstract expressionism and everything American. Here was this man actually painting the human figure in this quite shocking way at that time.
Bacon had a slowly growing reputation, but he was an extremely difficult artist. So it took a great deal of time for Bacon's imagery to become popular, but bit by bit, exhibition by exhibition, collector by collector, Bacon's reputation was being made. Peter Lacy said at this particular point, "You can come and live with me." And Bacon said, "Well, what does living with you mean?" And Lacy said, "Well, I could chain you to the wall." And Bacon said, "Well, the thing is, I did terribly want to paint." And so because of that, Lacy started visiting Tangier. By that time, the relationship had broken down. Bacon felt he needed to go to another stage. He wanted to go to the very top. And there was a powerful, relatively new gallery called Marlborough Fine Art.
Bacon had been considering leaving Erica in the Hanover Gallery for some time because he was quite overwhelmed by debts. The Marlborough Gallery, for example, had deeper pockets, could pay a kind of salary.
They were like a cash flow for him. I remember going in with him to pick up a wad of cash so that he could go on sort of inviting everybody in sight to champagne and dinner afterwards, and then go and play the tables.
And the great attraction at the time for the Marlborough was what?
They've got, as they have galleries all over the world, perhaps they thought they could do something with me.
Frank Lloyd, the owner, partner of Marlborough, realised that I think that Francis was going to be the golden goose if they marketed it properly. It did need a lot of managing, and the only release for the paintings came through Valerie. She was my direct boss.
Francis Bacon's life at Marlborough revolved to a huge extent around Valerie Beston, or as he called her, Valerie from the gallery. She was always there for him. It was as if Bacon was the love of her life. And she was, completely 100% devoted in the same way that Erica Brawson had been initially in his career.
I mean, they were saying to Bacon, "We'll give you exhibitions at the Tate." And they absolutely delivered on their promises. Within 3 years, he got the first Tate retrospective.
There were many critics who still did not like Bacon's work. The Tate retrospective in 1962, I think, was very important for him.
I think Bacon created best when he was himself most disturbed, most at sea.
He does go into a kind of crisis. That may have been what was happening with Bacon at that time. I think that was to do with his inner need to renew his art, to not repeat himself, to stretch. He did a painting right before the 1962 Tate exhibition called, I believe it's called 3 Studies for a Crucifixion. It's an indication of where he wants to go.
It's a blood red and black triptych. In the left-hand panel, there is a paternal figure, more or less telling a smaller figure to go. I've always thought of that as Bacon being thrown out of the house. In the middle, there is a scene, a really bloody, mangled scene on a bed.
It's the most extreme expression of the horror he felt about his life, I think, and what it felt to be Francis Bacon and all the horrors he'd witnessed. And he did describe the central panel as someone shot to pieces on a bed. And that's not normal language, not just from him, but for a Bacon painting. And in this case, well, it does look like someone shot to pieces on a bed.
It looks like a murder has taken place. He would almost empty himself of his darkest, bitterest thoughts on canvas and be purified. But of course, he was Jekyll and Hyde. And so the two sides were there in the man.
I remember going to the big 62 retrospective of the Tate. And I had a very nice girlfriend who was vegetarian, though she converted under my tutelage to meat, but she didn't convert to bacon.
I think that was when he really came out as a superstar in Britain, anyway. And I think he saw this was a perfect moment for him to shine, and my God, shine he did.
But amongst the telegrams of congratulation, he got one from Tangier saying that his great love, Peter Lacy, had just died. Bacon was convinced it was a suicide. He talked about it as a suicide, and that Peter had almost deliberately aimed for it to happen on the day his show opened.
The painting of where Peter Lacy was buried was enormously, enormously powerful painting, full of, you can't call it love exactly, but full of sort of dark sexual obsession.
He's got his new studio in Rhys Mews, I think was very important to him. He felt he'd got his own space, he could really get to work and do what he wanted to say powerfully.
We're in a wonderful little secret mews just off of South Kent called Rhys Mews. And I first came to know it when I met Lionel Bart. His neighbour turned out to be Francis Bacon. He was very funny, he was very witty, he was very clever, but there was a kind of an underlying kind of melancholy about him. But Lionel Bart told me that in his kitchen there were loads of photographs, and he'd noticed there were rather a lot of me, you know, and Lionel said to him, oh, you think, you know, you like Terence? And Francis said, God, the two most handsomest men in the world are Terence Stamp and Colonel Gaddafi. I thought, yeah, Colonel Gaddafi give him a good hiding, you know. I'd just knock on his door if I was passing, and if he would open the door, sometimes he'd invite me in, sometimes he wouldn't. And sometimes when he invited me in, I realized he was in the middle of something. It struck me there was a very private thing that was happening, and he had to devote himself completely to it.
As an artist, Bacon was always trying to do it a bit better. No, you've never arrived. There wouldn't be much point if you'd arrived. You know, he would have stopped painting in 1962 or something if he was satisfied.
How are you going to trap reality? How are you going to trap appearance without making an illustration of it? And that is one of the great fights and one of the great excitements of being a figurative artist today.
It was a moment that he was beginning to look to the people that he was friends with, beginning to think about, you know, painting the people he felt he knew inside out.
I mean, he had a great love of people and a vulnerability to them. The artist doesn't choose the subject chooses the artist. That there was his subject.
I only am able to paint people, or the portraits of people that I know very well, and I've looked at a great deal, and that I have analysed and know the structure of their face. I find that the person there inhibits me. And then I look at photographs, so the photographs and everything get trodden on, they get even changed into other things. And those are often, in themselves, extremely interesting.
The presence of the person in a portrait is so fully there because he managed to empty himself of everything so that that person could come through him and onto the canvas.
Of course, men were a great subject for him, and the male body. Women were also extremely important to Bacon, both personally and in terms of his art. He had a need for family, and he sort of put a lot of women into that role, and he had a number of those throughout his life.
J'ai eu une amitié amoureuse, je crois, envers lui. Mais une forme d'amour, ça c'est sûr. Mais il n'a jamais fait de peinture de moi. Peut-être que maintenant, ça l'intéresserait plus de me peindre, toute ridée que je suis, qu'avant.
You look at the women he chose to paint, they have very strong characteristics in common. Muriel had a very strong visage that was almost imperial, and it was easy for him, in a sense, to convey exactly that strength of character that she had. Isabel Rawthorne was another, a woman of almost staggering physical presence. And Henrietta Morris, who was curvaceous, but she was also very, very strong.
I first met Henrietta Morris across a big lunch table, and it was like being opposite a Bacon painting. I mean, it was almost as if she wasn't real because of that. His portraits of Henrietta.
Well, Henrietta is one of the most interesting of the Soho characters. She, like many others, could not wait to get away from her convent past and get into the life of Soho.
Hen, oh, she was amazing. She was one of the most wonderful people I've ever known. No wonder Francis adored her, you know. And Francis understood, you know, he was Irish. He understood how hard it is if you've been through that terrible sort of Catholicism thing, how dreadfully hard it is to break out of it and get free.
He was never burdened by that, was he? He was never burdened by that guilt.
Well, if he was, it was, I think he was a bit. Actually, I'm sorry, but I think he was.
Henrietta always said to me that, yes, well, perhaps he doth protest too much. I think he painted Henrietta 15 times. I mean, his work can be seen as a search for God, although he would probably certainly deny it. And his sort of frustration, if you like, with not finding God.
He was obsessed by sex. He was plugged into all sorts of different things that most people aren't aware of. When we were out at certain moments, he'd sort of almost walk through a wall into a different world and disappear. And what happened then, I don't know.
J'ai peur de la violence, même que j'ai subi la violence souvent.
The next day, he'd reappear in a damaged state, you know, barely able to walk or turn his head. And there was no point in sort of saying, well, what happened, Francis? Because he'd, at best, he'd just, he'd just fix you with a sort of basilisk stare and say, what do you mean?
J'ai perdu tous mes dents avec mes amis.
I was fast asleep one night when the phone went, and Valerie Beston said to me, Paul, quickly, you've got to come to Rhys Mews. I got there, and he had a huge injury right the way across from his left eye, right the way across, right round the right eye. All the skin had been broken, and he was in a terrible mess. And I said, Francis, you need a plastic surgeon. No, he said, you sew me up now. I said, I'll put some local anaesthetic in. He said to me, no, I don't want any local anaesthetic. So that's the only time I realised that he quite enjoyed being hurt. Francis liked the criminal side of London. You know, he liked the kind of sordidness of London, all that kind of East End dross and knowing all those kind of people, or wanting to know all those kind of people.
George Dyer came on the scene as this tough, well-built, muscular, boxer-like East End thug.
And I think through George, he, was able, George and George's family, through all that, he got to know, quite a lot of bad boys.
I like painting good-looking people because I like their bone structure. I loathe my own.
But little by little, it became apparent that however sort of virile and thug-like he looked, he was actually a very nice, lost young man. George was obviously rather reticent with the whip. So little by little, Francis became disabused because George had been, in that sense, a disappointment.
He was a kind of very feeble East End thug, and he liked children and animals and cuddling. Bacon said, I hate the billing and cooing of sex. I just like the sex. And he wanted George to rape him, and George wanted to cuddle.
George was suffering from erectile dysfunction. It seems to me that Francis had emasculated George. He found what he saw as the typical rough East Ender that he longed to find, and then he did that job of emasculating him.
Bacon was violent in the way he painted, that he was sadistic in the way he took apart George, with missing ears and missing jaws and missing eyes, missing everything, really. George was a bit appalled by the whole thing. He saw all these rich people standing around, sort of, in this smart gallery. He said to me, I think they're horrible. They're really horrible. He said, and he thinks I look like that. George knew all the prices for the pictures. And he said, and these people go and pay fucking thousands of pounds for him.
I mean, he portrays him as a kind of idiot. He has things with what looks almost like a nappy on his head or something, and dressed as a baby, and pictures of him nude and clothed, where one of them he's a baby. I mean, need I say more?
There were certainly moments when things were firing up between them. They had lovers' tiffs. The one time when Francis phoned me and said, you have to come round right away because George has gone berserk and all my suits are in the bath and he's poured paint all over them and he's trampling up and down and And I went round and I couldn't get in because the front door was barred. So I had to back the vehicle up, get up onto the roof and go through the window, where I was nearly throttled by George until he realised who it was. And he had in fact thrown 2/3 of the furniture down the staircase.
Dyer is fighting in a way that he is just going downhill, downhill, downhill. It must have been terrible to watch. So it's almost like a desperate attempt to get back in with Bacon and show Bacon that he is still a man.
Francis was painting fewer pictures of George. He was weary of him, I think, weary of his problems, of his drinking, of his carousing, of his unhappiness, perhaps.
His better judgment told him that he needed to be shot of Dyer.
Bacon began moving away from George. He looked more to Paris at a time when the other British artists were resolutely not looking to Paris.
Paris a eu une grande importance pour lui, je crois. À Paris, souvent c'était bon. On allait restaurant, boîte de nuit, ça faisait. On a rencontré là, il voulait absolument le connaître, Andy Warhol. Tous les peintres et écrivains allaient là-bas.
In 1971, getting a show at the Grand Palais was the great moment of his life. It was the turning point.
Huge, the first English artist to be offered the Grand Palais. So really, really big time.
It's very important this went well. I understand that the British Embassy were very worried in case a typical Bacon scene erupted and it was, something terrible happened there.
George, Francis, myself, Miss Beston, all had rooms in this particular hotel.
Everybody else was saying, don't bring George, he'll ruin everything. Dickie and Dennis and some others with Francis had gone out. And they saw the venue, and there was a big red carpet, and there were the soldiers standing there. And they all described to me these leather boots up to the knees and the red stripe up the soldiers' tight trousers, and they were fairly taken by this. And they said Francis was, you could see him sort of swell with pride at this. And they went back to the hotel thinking, this was going to be a good evening. And Francis went up to his room. There's a stink of drugs, unwashed bodies, dirty sex, and the rent boy, the very dirty rent boy who was in there with George. And Francis was furious. Dickie, Dennis and Francis, they went drinking, they went gambling, they had a 4, 5, 6 course meal. They hardly hurried home knowing that George was in such a bad state.
I can't remember exactly the time, but it must have been sort of 2 o'clock in the morning. There was a knock at my door and it was Francis. And he said, could he come and spend the night in my room, because I had double, 2 beds. Because George had brought home an Arab with smelly feet. And it was so disgusting, you couldn't stand it any longer. And in the morning, he said, just go and see if George has got rid of the Arab. There was no evidence of George being around. The bed was in a real state of disarray. And I then checked with Miss Beston around the room and looked in the bathroom, and George was on the toilet.
Apparently, Miss Beston pushed him out of the way, went in there and did pulses and things like this and said, no, he's dead.
I never even thought about it being a suicide attempt. It could well have been.
And so she said, right, I'll take care of this. And Terry was pushed out of the way, and down she went, and Valerie did the fixing to then make sure that the death was found 2 days later.
I think it was a joint decision between Francis, Valerie, and the hotel manager.
Why was that decision made?
It might have put the opening in jeopardy. It had to be sorted for Francis. It was bizarre to think that, this body was going to be left in a hotel room overnight.
You know, it's a hell of a thing to decide not to report a dead body. Whether that was Bacon's idea, you can't be sure. You know, I mean, it looks like maybe that's what happened, but it's still a hell of a thing. I mean, that's a crime.
Once the Grand Palais retrospective had opened, the news began to sort of filter out during this big celebration. And of course it got round with all the speed of bad news, and during the dinner, the whole room knew that George committed suicide, but up until then, nobody had heard. Francis himself was in the Grand Palais. I think it was as though he wasn't really there. He seemed totally abstracted, he was pale, but he went through with the dinner because he felt that it was better to go through with it than to cancel.
So the stories about Francis being told at the opening of his show and him being so brave and going ahead with the show despite having been given this dramatic news are absolute tosh. He knew that 2 days before. Someone may well have gone up to him and told him the story, but that was a bit of play acting.
There was a picture that the French had bought, a big triptych, which actually has George sitting on a sort of beautifully painted, creamy white toilet. And because the French state had just bought it, President Pompidou paused for a long time in front of that image. He had to stand there and talk about this image, knowing that George had recently died in exactly that position.
Qu'il a eu, il y avait les journalistes et caméras du monde entier qui étaient là. Il a joué son jeu de Francis Bacon. C'était très dur. Très dur.
And it was all awful and sad.
This tragic event, at the same time, gave him perhaps the deepest subject he was ever to have in his life.
It seems a bit mad painting portraits of dead people. After all, if their flesh has rotted away, once they're dead, you have your memory of them, but you haven't got them.
He actually went back to Paris to absorb the memories, to relive the events, and actually stayed in the same hotel where George had killed himself. And from this sort of well of guilt and grief, he dredged up these extraordinarily haunting images that are some of, I think, the most profound images in painting.
When it came into the gallery and I saw it for the first time, if Francis showed any emotion to the death, the emotion was in that painting. Everything that he felt about George was in those paintings. Maybe it was just about getting it out of his system. So paint them, get them out of the studio, and then maybe I feel better.
It got him recognition far beyond anything he'd ever had before. It was the turning point in sales and sort of international reputation.
He was au courant, you know, and the power of his paintings fitted the period.
Bacon was in Paris from about 1974 to the mid-80s. He walked in, he said, "This is it." So I said, "Well, Francis, don't you want to see the kitchen and bathroom?" No, let's take it. He moved in and started painting almost immediately. He was able really to renew himself in Paris. I think the alternate suited him very well, going from London to Paris, having new ideas while he was in Paris, wanting to complete a canvas before he left to go back to London.
In Rhys Mews, I was right next door to Francis Bacon, who already at that time, late 70s, was famous. And I would fix little things for him, like a leaky pipe, electricity problem, or I'd drive him somewhere. We sort of fairly quickly got over the homosexual vibes, if I put it that way. We got into that, and I said, I just do not fancy men.
Bacon became a quite lonely man. The aging process is particularly hard on homosexuals, so he was in a position of diminished physical beauty, as it were.
C'est beaucoup plus difficile pour un homosexuel d'être vieux.
D'accepter.
Oui. Parce que l'homosexualité, ça flotte sur la beauté. Dans la même façon, mais c'est beaucoup plus difficile d'être homme que d'être femme.
I went a few times with Francis to the West End gay clubs. Sometimes John Edwards was there, sometimes not. John was like a son he never had, a friend. There had been maybe a sexual relationship at the beginning, but I don't think it lasted. He really, really cared for John.
John Edwards came into his life in a curious fashion. He ran or helped to run a pub in the East End, and Bacon had been there and said he'd come back with some friends and asked John to stock in some champagne. And then Bacon didn't turn up. John was mightily pissed off, and at some point in the Colin room told him, and this amused Bacon.
John said to me, "I went out of my way to make friends with Francis. I went to the Colony Club, and I said to Francis, I'm buying a bottle of champagne and I want to share it with you." And so he introduced himself to Francis.
The important thing about the Edwards relationship was that it was paternal, but it's not always clear who's the father and who's the son.
Oh, come in, John. I'm glad you came down. John is David is just asking me the most difficult question.
It's quite understandable that the circle would look like this and say, who is he? What's he want? Is he trying to take advantage?
Francis came to me one day and he said, "Paul, I want to give you a painting." And then a few days later he came and he said, "John has refused to allow me to give you a painting. I know I promised you a painting, but I can't give it to you."
Well, Bacon said he thought about death every day of his life. And as he aged, it must have become more and more present to him, death. And as his friends died, others died. The death of Muriel, I think the fading of the colony must have been difficult for Bacon.
In the 80s, Soho really had ended. It was pretty much, running on fumes. And I think that had a very depressing influence on Bacon on top of everything else. It's what is it, 40 years on or something? And he would have been reminded greatly about the passing of time.
Well, I'd seen Bacon around a lot, but never spoken to him because I kind of, was a kind of hero or something. So, and I was quite young. But I'd seen him I'd used to see him in cafes in Soho. And if I'd been out late, I'd end up, going in early in the morning into a cafe, and sometimes I'd be having breakfast. So it was quite kind of odd to be in the same room as him and not speak to him. But then I just thought, what the hell would I say or whatever.
In his last years, he looked very old and very tired, and he must have felt very pained at that moment, to see sort of the world flashing before his eyes.
John Ed was traveling a lot. He didn't live in London. And again, I was living, 20 meters away from him. So it deepened his trust in me. The opportunity came up to arrange a supper party at my place for Francis Bacon. Sir Frederick Ashton had already committed to come, who was the great choreographer of the time. I was left with an empty seat, and I thought, who can I invite? Jose Capello was someone I used to see at first instances at the Royal Opera House. He was interested in art, and I phoned Jose, and he leapt at the chance. And Ashton and Francis took an immediate liking to him.
And Francis was rather famous, of course, for liking a certain amount of roughish trade. There was an element of relief with Jose, because Jose was kind of firmly well-educated, professional, middle class, and so it was much easier to talk to.
Francis Bacon and Jose Capello shared a safety deposit box at Harrods. They both had keys. John wanted the key from Jose. Jose was very difficult to read as far as what really drove him. And I never went further. He would clam up. They were traveling together. They would go to Venice, Madrid. Francis would come back with a big smile on his face. He was a happy man. He was in love. And for Francis, that obviously meant sexually was going well.
Yes, in 1988, he's inspired. He reworks, restudies. It is not brutish any longer, you know? It's as if the monsters have been turned into silk, and they no longer are going to jump out of the frame and bite you. There's something distant, but that's kind of fascinating too, you know? I mean, to look at your earlier work and your earlier juicy brutality and then make it more designed, distant, behind glass. It's another feeling.
The figure at the base of the Crucifixion, I mean, that's just an unbelievable painting. I mean, I made a couple of pieces which were directly, you know, taken from Bacon paintings. Like I made it with a three-dimensional triptych. I saw these kind of terrifying social spaces that Bacon was painting. I remember thinking, I wonder if I could actually make these spaces. I got a phone call from the Sartre Gallery and they said, oh, Bacon was in today and he was stood in front of your sculpture for an hour. And I was like, an hour? No, it can't be an hour.
It's around September 1990. We went up to Saatchi's the first time he saw Damien Hirst. He liked one piece in Damien Hirst, and we came back and we were having drinks. Now, after you drunk a bottle of wine, you comes to things that really matter, and it's not looking at Damien Hirst, it's your love affair. Jose had framed it like, Francis, I want to stay your friend. That means no more sexual relationship. And for Francis Bacon knew exactly what it meant, and he was devastated. So Francis, in his cups, told me about the relationship in those 2 years with Jose, and the fact that he'd given Jose $4 million US and 2 of his paintings. I could read his pain, how gutted he was, his anguish.
Well, I would say he slowly deteriorated from 1990 over the following 2 years. And I took him to one specialist after another, and none of them could help him. He kept saying to me, I've got to go to Madrid because I want to see José.
Il avait ce besoin-là. Il avait besoin de certains masochismes. Ça, je pense. Je peux pas en être certaine, mais presque. Il m'a appelée avec une voix très différente que d'habitude. Mais c'était une voix comme s'il voulait me parler, je sais pas. C'est peut-être une idée à moi, mais je ne crois pas. Sa voix était totalement différente. Il devait sentir la mort, je suppose. Et ça me trouble beaucoup, ça.
Finally, Francis Bacon, one of the most highly acclaimed British painters this century, has died.
The painter Francis Bacon has died at the age of 82.
He collapsed while on holiday in Spain. It's thought he had a heart attack.
I was really destroyed when I heard he had died. It was really very, very sad. But it was inevitable. He was reckless about his own life and other people's lives, I think.
What caused the heart attack? Did Jose and Francis have a huge row? And Francis had the heart attack when he was whisked off to the hospital. Francis was in a Catholic hospital being attended by Catholic nuns, and Jose was not there.
Well, I think that if Bacon is consistent, he has to be prepared to die at any time, to be taken advantage of at any time, for things not to work out at any time, and I think he was. He was a gambler. He understood that gamblers usually lose.
The study of a bull, the last painting Bacon completed, this mostly raw canvas. I don't think that's a question of it being unfinished in any sense. He said what he wanted to say in that top left corner of the painting. The bull seems to be shifting between two spaces. That seems like life and death. And the fact he used dust as a medium, this is the dust to which he will return, as indeed he did in Madrid only a few months later.
Whatever it is, 50 years, 75 years later, they seem even more important, more monumental in their effect, which is what's so wonderful about the Francis painting, to my mind. There's a sort of sacred quality to them.